Infinitive Absolute. In the last chapter, I introduced to you Hebrew infinitives, and I said that there are two types: the infinitive construct, which is what we dealt with for most of last chapter, and the infinitive absolute. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the infinitive absolute, and then at the end, we'll also look at some pronominal suffixes. But most of what this chapter will deal with is infinitive absolutes. Now, one of the major differences we noted is that the infinitive construct can take inseparable prepositions and pronominal suffixes, while the infinitive absolute cannot. So if we draw little diagrams again, if that represents our infinitive construct, then it can often take a inseparable preposition at the front, so be, le, or que, and be or que, if you remember, it should be translated temporally: when, while, as. And le, we gave three options: purpose, epexegesis, and object complement of the verb. In other words, verbs that need a little bit more to fill them out. So infinitive constructs can take inseparable prepositions at the front and or pronominal suffixes at the end, and we noted that that's usually subjective. Usually this is the subject of the infinitive construct. In contrast to that, if this is an infinitive absolute, it can't take either of these inseparable prepositions, if I can say that, and it can't take pronominal suffixes. What it can take is the vav. You can get the vav, and you can have the interrogative he. If you remember, it's the he with the chataf patach. So these are infinitive absolutes. You can get this if your sentence is a question and your infinitive absolute is at the beginning of the sentence. And I found one example where you have an infinitive absolute with an article in Numbers 10:39, but obviously that's minor if there's only one example of them. So let us look at the form. Let's compare the form of these two. So first I'll reintroduce or remind you of the infinitive construct. If these are our three root letters, do you remember what it was? We had a shava and a holem, right? Pekod. Often this is the same as the imperative. So that's our infinitive construct. So what does our infinitive absolute look like? Well, let's put our root letters in here. I'll leave a little space here. The first letter is a kametz, the first vowel, and the second vowel here is a holem vav. That's why I left a space there, because the holem. And sometimes this will be written defectively without the vav. So, but you have a o, a o. Now let's compare this with the perfect. If you remember, well, pakad, right? Pakad is our paradigm verb. If we have pakad here, we have kametz here, so that's the same as the infinitive absolute, and our theme vowel is patach. This is for the dynamic verbs, which is the largest group, and these are the ones we first introduced to you. And these are this is your paradigm that you need to memorize. But then we also said that there are two other types, two other patterns, I suppose. 1, 2, and the difference was this, right? Difference was the theme vowel. So do you remember what those were? We have patach for our dynamics, and then we have tsere, like kaved, and holem, like yachol. These are a minor set compared to the dynamics, but they tend to be stative. Not always, but they tend to be. Now, I just bring this up because, well, to show two things. One is the infinitive absolute starts with the same vowel as the perfect, all the way down. You've got a kametz. And secondly, if you have an infinitive absolute written defectively, without this vav here, just with the holem, then you could confuse it with the stative that has the holem as the theme vowel. They would look the same. It's not a big deal because there are not that many verbs that take this anyway. And context will usually tell you if you're dealing with a regular perfect or with something that needs to be an infinitive absolute. Okay. The other thing I want to show you with the form, well, two more things. If you have, let's write out our infinitive absolute. So we have comets and we have holum. Actually, let's move this over. Okay. Paintbrush here. If we have a strong guttural here in the third position, then something can happen. If you go back to Ross chapter 2, I think it's section 2.8, he talks about the furtive patach, if you remember that. And the rule there is this. If you have a strong guttural at the end of a word, and by strong guttural he means a hey, a hate, or an ayin, so not an aleph, and not a resh. Resh isn't actually even a guttural. But these are your strong gutturals. If you have one of them here, and just before it you have a full long accented vowel, pa code, stresses here, so it's accented, it's full, it's long. If you have that, then you'll get a furtive patach showing up right here, in order to help you move from this full long vowel to the strong guttural. It's a pronunciation thing. So, an example here would be sha. So we got our comets there. Second root letter is lamed. Shalo. Here's our theme vowel for the infinitive absolute. And then we have hate. Shalo. Ach. It's not shaloch, it's shaloach. Okay, and this means to send, or shalach means to send. There's another shalach with a kaf here at the end. That means to throw. So don't get those mixed up. But this one is to send. So you get a furtive patach if you have a strong guttural as at the end of your infinitive absolute. Now, the last thing I want to show you with form is to compare this to nouns and adjectives, and to talk about why we call them construct and absolute. Now, we looked at this a bit. We looked at this for the construct in the last chapter. If you remember, if we have a construct and we have o, okay, that's our construct form. We said that these infinitive constructs can take pronominal suffixes, but they can also take a noun. The noun can be the subject or the object. And I mentioned when we talked about this that it is as if the infinitive construct is functioning like a noun in construct with another noun. So it's as if these are two nouns, and this is a bound unit. If you go back to our construct chapter, I can't remember which one that was, we said that if you have a noun, it can be followed by another noun. The first one's called the construct, the second one's called the absolute, and there's a link between them. Okay? And this is why we call this infinitive the infinitive construct, because in this arrangement with another noun, it is functioning something like a noun construct, in construct with a noun absolute. Now, I got this next little bit here from João Maroca on page 144. He makes a comparison with, actually it's an adjective, but an adjective functioning substantively like a noun. So if I write this down here, gadol and gidol, oops. This is an adjective meaning great or large or big. In the substantive, it can be noble, like a noble person, a noble. So this is the absolute form if it's functioning as a noun, and this is the construct form. Now, what's interesting is if you compare these forms to our infinitives, these of course are adjectives function as nouns, but if you compare them to the forms for the infinitive, let me just write them down fresh here. The infinitive construct is what? It's I, right? Shava, followed by a holum. Okay? And the infinitive or absolute, which I just introduced to you a few moments ago, the form is comets and holum. Let me scoot this over. Should have anticipated that. And a holem vav. Now look at the similarities here. We have I, we have holem, vav, and holem, so there's a bit of a discontinuity there. But we still have the holem. And then here we have comets, and we have holem, vav, and holem, vav. So there is this parallel between nouns, and these are functioned as nouns, even though they're adjectives, nouns in the construct and absolute, their form, and infinitive construct and infinitive absolute and their form. So the naming here isn't completely wild and arbitrary. There is a parallel with how nouns function. The other thing, of course, is that the construct, one of the things about the construct is that it can attach to things. So you can have a pronominal suffix here, or it can be associated. It's not directly attached, but it's certainly associated with the next noun. And infinitive constructs are like that. But infinitive absolutes, absolute means by itself, absolutely alone. So that's another way to think of these, is that the infinitive absolute really stands much more like an absolute noun by itself. And if you think about it, when nouns in the absolute take a pronominal suffix, which they can, of course, they tend to reduce over here. And so it's almost like they are becoming a construct. So if you attach something to a noun, it really is becoming a bit like a construct. Anyway, if all this is confusing to you, just forget it. Pay attention to this here. Let's go back to this page here. These are the two things you need to know. Infinitive construct, I, O, and infinitive absolute, A, with a full holem vav generally, sometimes written defectively with just the holem.